The wind came first, as it always did on the hill. It swept through the eucalyptus and traced the edges of the weathered homestead like a familiar ghost. Margaret Donnelly stood on her veranda, one hand wrapped around her mug of tea, the other resting lightly on the railing where the paint had long since peeled away. 82 years old and still standing on legs that ached and a land that hummed. The green hill rolled out before her like a worn quilt, stitched with memory and scar. This was the place her father had fenced with war-torn hands. The place her mother had given birth beneath a fig tree in a storm. The place Margaret had buried a husband, raised a child, and now waited, alone, with time circling closer. She'd stopped counting the days. They were all quiet now, sheep in the paddock, a crow on the mailbox. The steady pulse of wind across grass, yet her mind remained sharp, and her body, though fading, still answered to the rhythms of the earth. She had always known she would never leave this place not alive, but there were things left undone, things buried deeper than the fig tree roots. That morning, she sat at the kitchen table, sunlight pouring through the lace curtains, and began to write, not a will, not quite. A letter, simple, handwritten, to her grandchildren, now grown and scattered in the city like dry leaves in a storm. She hadn't seen them in years. Distance, lives, and time had stretched too wide between them. But she remembered each of their childhood footprints in the soil. Ben, Emily, Lucy. Their laughter, their arguments, their bare feet running wild through the paddocks. She wrote with care, her hand slow but steady, no mention of illness or dying, no guilt. Just an invitation. Come home. Not to say goodbye, but to remember. The land is still here. I am still here. For now. The letter was folded, sealed, and set aside. The wind would carry it in its own way. Later, Margaret walked down the path past the shed her father built, her cane tapping a rhythm. Only the birds seemed to hear. She paused at the gate, looking out at the fig tree now twisted, hollow, but still standing. Everything had changed, and everything remained. The sun was beginning to dip when she turned back toward the house. Inside, she turned on the old cassette player. A song from another time drifted through the rooms, weaving itself into the grain of the floorboards. Outside, the wind picked up again. It carried her letter down the valley and toward the city, where memories waited to be stirred. And family, whether they knew it yet or not, were already on their way back home. The train from Sydney was quiet, filled mostly with commuters and late spring tourists. But for Ben, Emily, and Lucy Donnelly, the silence between them spoke louder than any conversation could. It had been years since they'd last seen one another, longer still, since they had stood together under the open sky of their grandmother's land. Each carried their own history, their own guilt, their own reasons for staying away. And yet, when the letter came, not one of them could ignore it. Ben stared out the window, his jaw tight, fingers curled around a faded photo of his daughter tucked into his wallet. Divorce had left him bitter, a little adrift, and truth be told, the thought of fresh air and the weightless vastness of the hill unnerved him. Emily sat across from him, impeccably dressed even in travel, her tablet filled with case notes she pretended to study. The hill, to her, had always felt like a pause button, one she couldn't afford to press for long. And Lucy, headphones in, head bobbing lightly to some invisible rhythm, watched them both with quiet amusement. Of the three, she had wandered furthest: music, festivals, cities that didn't sleep. But something in her grandmother's handwriting had caught her chest. I am still here, for now. It sounded more like poetry than warning. They arrived in the early afternoon, the train exhaling them into the dust and sun of a country platform that smelled of eucalyptus and dry wind. A neighbor with a rusty ute was waiting, just like Margaret had promised. No fuss. No welcome signs. Just a nod and the familiar rattle of the hill-bound road. The homestead emerged like a memory through the tall grass. Weathered wood, a sloping tin roof, the old gum tree at the gate. Margaret stood on the veranda, framed by the screen door, looking smaller than they remembered but no less commanding. Her hair was white now, pulled into a bun. Her cane rested nearby. Well, she said, with that same quiet strength, you're late. Ben chuckled, tension breaking. Emily smiled and kissed her cheek. Lucy hugged her like no time had passed. Inside, the house was the same and not the same. Faded family photos lined the hallway. A kettle whistled in the kitchen. The scent of scones lingered. They sat around the table, cups in hand, awkwardness softened by steam and sugar. That night, the three wandered the fields. Emily walked the boundary line where the old fig tree once stood. Ben sat on the fence post, staring out into the stillness. Lucy recorded the sounds of the breeze, the insects, the creaking of the windmill. Unsure why, but needing to. The stars came out one by one, sharp and bright. It was like someone had unzipped the sky. Back in the house, Margaret watched them through the window. The hill, she thought, had begun its work. It always did, when the city came home. The storm came in low and quiet, gray clouds creeping across the sky like a held breath. By dusk, the wind had shifted, and the first droplets began to patter on the tin roof. Steady and rhythmic, like a ticking clock. The power flickered, then surrendered entirely, and the Donnelly homestead settled into candlelight. Margaret lit them without ceremony, one on the mantel, one near the family photographs, and one at the center of the kitchen table. The grandchildren gathered there instinctively, drawn by the glow, by the warmth, by something older than electricity. Wine was opened. Stories began to surface, not the big ones, not yet, but small offerings. Lucy talking about the gig she played in Melbourne, where a man proposed mid-song. Emily sharing the absurdity of a court case involving a stolen peacock. Ben quietly describing the birthday dinner he missed for his daughter. The silence it left afterward. Then Margaret spoke. There was a brother, she said, voice calm, like it had waited decades for this storm. Before your mother, before any of you, born early, took one breath, and was gone. The room stilled. I named him Michael, she said, but no one else did. He's buried up past the fig tree. We didn't mark it, we weren't allowed to. My father said it was better not to speak of things that didn't last. No one knew what to say. The thunder answered for them. Later, Ben wandered into the sitting room and found a box tucked behind the bookcase. Inside were letters, thin blue airmail envelopes addressed to Margaret from a man named Arthur. A name he'd never heard. War letters, full of longing and guilt and unfinished dreams. None signed with a last name. Emily, exploring the old desk in the hallway, came across a folded map with boundary lines drawn and redrawn in pencil. A small corner was circled. It didn't belong to any official survey. Next to it, in faded ink, M's corner. Keep safe. Lucy slipped outside between showers, earbuds in, following the melody of rain across the veranda. The cassette she'd found earlier played softly, Margaret's younger voice singing a lullaby. Half in English, half in something older, wilder, part Gaelic, part Wiradjuri. Lucy didn't understand the words, but she felt them, like wind through bone. When the rain finally eased, the three of them met in the hallway, each holding something the others hadn't seen. They laid it all on the kitchen table, the letters, the map, the memory. Margaret sat down slowly beside them. We carry what we bury, she said, even the unspoken. Outside, the land drank deep. The soil softened. The air held stillness. Not silence, but listening. And inside the old house, the Donnellys began to remember what it meant to be family, not just by name, but by story. Margaret refused the hospital, even when the coughing came more often and the walks to the garden became shorter. This land raised me, she said, and it'll take me back in its own time. The doctor from town came out once, listened to her lungs, and left a bottle of pills she never opened. She preferred the kettle and the window. The grandchildren stopped asking her to rest. Instead, they worked. Not in a frantic, fixing way, but in a slow, reverent rhythm that mirrored the hill itself. Emily took charge of the paperwork, scanning old deeds, calling council offices, circling Margaret's hand-drawn boundary lines. Ben took to the fences, hammering in loose nails, painting the old shed, fixing what time had worn thin. Lucy wandered more than she worked, documenting everything with her voice recorder, gathering sounds, stories, and the rustle of wind in the grass. There was peace in their presence, in the routine of shared meals and silent cups of tea. One afternoon, Lucy found Margaret dozing in her chair and began to sing softly, the lullaby from the cassette. The words were still strange, but the melody sat in her chest like a heartbeat. Margaret opened her eyes and smiled, whispering the next line. That night, Ben stood by the fig tree, phone to his ear, telling his daughter about the land, about the magpies and the dirt under his nails, about a grandmother she barely knew. When he hung up, he didn't feel the usual ache of absence. He felt rooted. Emily walked the line of the hill at dawn, stones in her pocket, placing one at each marker. Her grandmother had once named in Story M's corner, the wind split, where we found the fox cubs. She didn't need legal clarity. She needed memory to be tangible. Margaret grew quieter, but not smaller. Her presence remained like the land, subtle, essential, patient. She asked Lucy to record her voice, just once. Not for posterity, not for legacy, but because she said with a sly smile, "I'd like the wind to carry me when I go." And so, Lucy did. The three sat with her that evening, watching the sky fade from gold to violet. No dramatic speeches. No final confessions. Just the hill, the house, the breath of a family rediscovering its shape. "I'm not afraid," Margaret said, "not because I know what comes next, but because I've seen what came before." And it was enough. The wind rose gently. The fig tree creaked. And somewhere in the distance, a magpie sang. The end was coming, but no one rushed it. On the hill, everything moved slowly. Exactly as it should. Margaret passed just before sunrise, wrapped in her wool blanket on the veranda, facing east as the light climbed over the ridge. Lucy had fallen asleep beside her, notebook in hand, the cassette recorder still running. When she woke to the silence, she didn't cry. She pressed stop, kissed Margaret's hand and whispered, "The wind's got you now." The funeral was simple, just as Margaret wanted. A wooden box, wildflowers from the hill, stories told in small circles. The community came in quiet waves, old neighbors, childhood friends, even the town doctor who said little and stayed longest. They buried her beneath the fig tree, where the earth was soft, roots wrapping around memory. Afterward, the three stayed. There was no decision to be made, it simply happened. Ben extended his leave. Emily delayed a court date. Lucy canceled a gig in Perth and unpacked her bags without a word. They worked differently now, with Margaret's absence folding into the routines like an echo. Ben began sketching a plan for a small cabin near the edge of the southern paddock space for him, for his daughter, who'd texted to say she wanted to visit. Emily filed the heritage paperwork for the land, preserving it officially, but more so symbolically as a place worth remembering. Lucy finished her recordings and called the album Hill Songs. It was mostly field audio and fragments of voice. The final track, Margaret's laugh, carried on the wind. Time didn't slow, but it moved kindly. Some mornings, they'd sit together on the veranda with coffee and no agenda. The wind would shift. The magpies would call. The land felt alive, not in a mystical way, but in the way that anything honest and old must be. One evening, Lucy played her album through the speakers. As Margaret's voice filled the air, half song, half story, they sat in silence. Not heavy, just full. Before they left, Emily placed a single stone on the edge of Margaret's grave. "So no one forgets," she said. The house remained. So did the hill. So did the wind. Life returned to Sydney in due time, but it came with a thread tying them back not just to Margaret, but to the version of themselves they found in her presence. In the final scene, the camera pans out, the house, the tree, the three shadows sitting still. The wind lifts gently, sweeping across the grass. And from somewhere deep in the soil, the land remembers.